Vultures. We don't really find vultures very attractive, but we can't even ignore them because of the elegance with which they soar up in the sky. In fact, they epitomize freedom. And I'm sure there is nobody on this planet who has seen a vulture glide above the head and not really want to do the same. In India, there are 9 species of vultures. From the smallest of them all are called the Egyptian vulture to the largest in the subcontinent, that is the lammergeier. We have species like the red-headed vulture, the cinereous vulture, which is a migrant. It comes into India, especially the northwestern region during winter. It's also a massive vulture. I have been fortunate to sight cinereous vultures in the little run of Kutch, and I still remember, if I shut my eyes, I can actually see the bird fly just few feet above the ground and then rise up on thermals going up. Fascinating. 2 more species, that is the Eurasian Griffin and the Himalayan Griffin. The Eurasian Griffin is common just from the north of central India to North India, also found in some higher reaches, but the Himalayan Griffin, as the name suggests, is found up in the Himalayas, and you see them actually flying below you when you are climbing up the mountains. It's again fascinating to see a large bird like this at eye level or below you. When you see a vulture fly effortlessly without flapping their wings, it's so fascinating. All they do is just move their primaries so that the air can move, and then they can take those subtle deviations as they go up in the valleys, in the mountains. Fascinating, of course. And then you have 3 other species belonging to the genus Gyps. And of these 2, which is the white-rumped and the long-billed, were once upon a time the most common species of vultures and the most gregarious of them all. In fact, I remember nearly 30 years ago seeing thousands of vultures right in the middle of Ahmedabad city. I've also seen them in good numbers in Bombay. So they were not just limited to forest regions, but they were found even in urban settings, because the food of vultures is carrion, dead animals. So in the forest, they get wild animals, but otherwise all across the country, India being a country that has a very high density of livestock, obviously when an animal dies, the dead body is thrown at the edge of the village, and that's where the vultures would come down. And there are sites and photographs taken in 1950s, 60s, 70s, where you could see hundreds of vultures on dead animals. And then there is that 3rd species, the slender-billed vulture, which is also a gyps species. In fact, till a certain point in time, it was considered as a subspecies of long-billed vulture. But it is distinctly different, because the long-billed vulture builds its nest on cliffs, on rocks, whereas the slender-billed always nests on trees. And so these are 9 species, and as I said, India supports them because it's a tropical country. There is a good biomass of animals that are available for the scavengers like vultures to feed on, also because of large holdings of livestock in the country. This is just, by the way, the beginning of the story. It's not such a happy story. However, lately I do see some hope, but in mid-90s, to be precise, 96, 97, the BNHS scientist, Bombay Natural History Society, was doing a long-term study of the wetlands in Bharatpur Bird Sanctuary, which is also called the Keoladeo National Park in Rajasthan. Researchers saw vultures that were looking very frail. All of them had a drooping neck, and such vultures would just keep sitting all day, not fly, and in a few days collapse and fall dead. And so that was the first report of vultures dying. At that point, nobody knew. It was very, very mysterious how a species which was so common was dying without any apparent reason. Obviously, everybody was shocked. It made news. It was cover page everywhere. There were many articles written on them. There were a lot of conjectures that were made. But there was a school of thought that said that there could be a pathogen that's kind of a epidemic that's taking life of these 3 species. The other species are fine. And so research started. BNHS, with the help of IVRI, RSPB, and ZSL, they started trying to dig deep into these casualties, and they were collecting tissue samples. After these first reportings, it was found that these 3 species were dying pretty much across its entire range, and so they were collecting tissue samples from dead vultures and also obviously making observations to see if there are any telltale signs of some behavior that they could kind of pinpoint the reason. For the next 8 years, research continued. Vulture populations kept collapsing. Nearly 97-98% of all vultures belonging to these three species had vanished. So much so that in 2002, IUCN declared these three species as critically endangered. So in 1991, 92, 93, these vultures were not even considered as threatened, or they were not even categorized under the threatened species. And within a decade, they were critically endangered, which means that if we were not able to find answers, we would have lost them forever. So obviously, India became the focus of conservationists from across the world. BNHS, which was at the helm of it, because BNHS is an organization that started in 1880s, and obviously there were stalwarts like Salim Ali, Humayun Abdulari, who have worked and popularized, ornithology really. Asad Rahmani, all these people, J.C. Daniels. So BNHS was given the responsibility at that point to investigate. So it took them 8 years, but in 2004, they cracked the reason behind this phenomenal collapse. Initially, as I said, it was thought to be a pathogen, but through tissue samples, through very, very rigorous scientific studies, it was found that the reason behind this was a chemical, and that too a chemical that was used as an anti-inflammatory drug that was used as a painkiller for livestock. It was Diclofenac, and this Diclofenac is also being used for human beings, but the amount that is used for human beings is pretty low. And obviously, human beings are not natural prey or natural food. Obviously, they do go and feed on dead animals. Obviously, they can go and feed on a dead human being, but largely the impact on vultures was because of the Diclofenac that was being used in livestock. And there was a direct correlation between the visceral gout, which means the ailment that was actually killing them. So visceral gout is a disease that damages the kidney. And so there was a direct correlation between the presence of Diclofenac in the tissue of dead vultures and visceral gout. So that was a big breakthrough. Obviously, because of that, pressures was put on the pharmaceutical companies and also the government. And I'm very happy that the Indian government rose to the occasion and they said, we have to really ban this drug, because there was no ambiguity about the connection between the population collapse of the vultures and the drug. So in 2006, the government banned use of Diclofenac in livestock. The use of Diclofenac in human beings still continued. But as I said, the amount of Diclofenac used for human beings is low. And then another drug, because obviously there are millions of cattle in India, and obviously anti-inflammatory drug is an important drug for livestock. So a drug called Meloxicam was suggested for obvious reasons, that it was not creating the same kind of negative impact on vultures. So people at that point were quite hopeful, and they felt that the vultures will probably bounce back. But at that point, we must keep in mind that vultures are slow breeding. They are not like rodents, like rats or even cats, tigers. They have a very, very slow breeding cycle. And invariably, a female will lay one egg or two eggs, but eventually only one chick will survive to adulthood. And also, there are many, many reasons for mortality. Chicks could fall from cliffs, they could fall off from trees. Obviously, they are big birds and they have to continue flapping their wings to build the energy in their shoulders. Obviously, they live in a precarious place. So the mortality, infant mortality in vultures anyways, without Diclofenac is high. Unlike some species which are blessed because they have a shorter life cycle, which means they breed faster, vultures were not going to recover. So BNHS had obviously informed the world that while we know the reason, but to build back the population, because remember 97% collapse is a big thing. And so government had started thinking about a vulture recovery program. There were many different plans that were made in consultation with scientists, not only from India, but from across the world. They decided to create vulture safe zones. Now, what is vulture safe zones? Those zones where Diclofenac is definitely not going to be used. And because they are long-ranging birds, a vulture could be roosting in the middle of Bombay or in the middle of Delhi city, but it could fly almost 100 kilometers in a day to a carrion somewhere to feed. and it will come back. So you cannot have a vulture safe zone which is tiny. So a vulture safe zone, if you look at the species and the ecology of it,
which means an area of radius 100 kilometers, which is nearly 31,400 square kilometers. So those kinds of vulture safe zones had to be created,
so that if at all vultures can be reintroduced, they could be reintroduced in those areas. Because Diclofenac was banned, but since Diclofenac was being used in human beings, it was somehow reaching people who had livestock. So they would buy more medicines and Diclofenac, which is for humans, but they would administer many more drugs intravenously, which is meant for human beings. So it was not completely eliminated. Plus, there were other NSAIDs which replaced Diclofenac, but we didn't know. For instance, nimesulide, which was a drug that point in time was being used and extensively, but subsequently it was found that that drug also has a negative impact on the vultures. So NSAIDs, which is non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, group of drugs, not all drugs dangerous, but most of them are. So there are currently about 14-15 of them which are in the market, and we really don't know if all of them are safe. Many of them are not. So obviously you had to create an environment where if at all the vultures bred well, they could be reintroduced. So first thing was to create that, which means a lot more data had to be collected. Then BNHS, who was working on the species and which played a pivotal role in finding out what has happened to this magnificent group of birds, was given the responsibility to also set up what is called vulture breeding centers. So there was a vulture breeding program that was launched by the Indian government. The NHS was given the responsibility to handle the entire program. Obviously, the funding came both from Ministry of Environment and Forest and RSPB, which is an international organization operating out of UK. So they put the seed money, then the state governments put in money, and breeding centers spread across different areas of the country was set up. The first one was set up in 2004, and that was the breeding center in Haryana, in Pinjore, subsequently in Rajabhat Kawa in West Bengal, then Rani in Assam, and then the Central Zoo Authority also set up 4 other centers in different zoos in Telangana, in Madhya Pradesh and other states, of which the Madhya Pradesh center was also handled by BNHS. So BNHS was actually responsible for the breeding program of these 3 species, white rum, long-billed and the slender-billed vulture, in 4 of the 7 breeding centers that were sought. Now comes the good story. Obviously, I said it is a slow breeding species, and they have to be fed and maintained, which means a lot of cost. I think nearly 10 crores are spent every year to maintain the vulture population in these centers, these 4 centers. And this is like 2004 is when they started, and now it's 2021. So nearly 17 years later. The NHS is confident that a good population of vultures can be maintained, which is an insurance against future collapses. So there are 650 birds currently in these 4 centers that BNHS is managing. Obviously, MOEF, state governments are funding it, as well as RSPB for so many years. So it is quite fascinating that it's an international collaboration to bring this species back from the brink. So Pinjore has nearly 350 birds. Rajabhat Khawa is another 130. Rani has around 120, and I think there are about 54-55 vultures in the zoo in Bhopal. Then BNHS, obviously through their consultations with people who are working on vultures across the world, have also put in place a kind of a system to release these vultures, because finally it's about restocking vultures. Meanwhile, because of the removal of Diclofenac and the kind of pressure that was put by the government, in the last 5-6 years, one is started seeing vultures in areas where vultures were absolutely wiped off. So it's a good sign. Obviously, if you see vultures in those areas, means they are breeding somewhere, which is quite rare, which was very rare many years, for almost 10-15 years. So in nature, also the species is recovering, but as I said, because of the ecology of the species, the recovery is going to be extremely slow. So it has to be assisted through breeding programs, and in the breeding program nearly 650 birds are there. And so slowly today, as we speak, probably there are 30,000 birds of these 3 species in the country, spread in many different parts. And these 650 birds that are captive, with time these are going to be released. They have already released a few individuals with tags, and they are currently monitoring those birds. And again, the good thing is that many of these birds, just immediately after release, they do go and join existing flocks, But for eating, they would come back to the breeding center. So BNHS was running like a restaurant outside so that these vultures can come. But with time, these vultures have joined flocks and they are in fact settling down, and some of them are actually breeding in the wild. So from an era of, like a virtual population explosion of vultures to a steep decline, the fastest decline that any bird or animal had or any mammal had seen globally, to a phase where the government regulations have kind of aided a slow recovery in nature, to the assisted recovery of vultures in these centers that are jointly being managed by BNHS and the State Forest Department. It's a fascinating thing that human beings, who are largely the reasons for the problems that these species are facing, also have the power, if they actually want to, turn the table. However, they are still vulnerable. 30,000 spread across the country is not much. With climate change, with other issues, with vagaries in weather, because the disposal of dead animals has also changed over time. General practice, the culture has changed. So not so many dead animals are ending up out in the open, and therefore the food availability has actually gone down. Forests have got degraded. A lot of forests outside protected areas are not holding that kind of population of wild animals. So overall, the carrying capacity, so to say, of the country to hold vultures has changed drastically. Pollutants in the air, the impact of pollutants on the eggshell of birds of prey has been studied, which means that a heavy bird, like a female vulture sitting on the egg to hatch it, actually cracks the egg now because of certain pollutants that are there in the atmosphere. So there are so many things that human beings do, knowingly and unknowingly, which is impacting some species, which is completely unrelated to that they can even connect. So this example of vulture has actually shown that we have to be extremely careful as a species, that what we do to either improve our business or improve our lifestyle, and which looks pretty innocuous, can actually be threatening to species, so much so that a species that probably existed on this planet much before human beings got evolved can be wiped out in a decade. Look at the ecological time scale. So vultures probably have been here for millions of years, and it just took probably 20-30 years, because what happened in 1995-96 was obviously happening because of a cumulative effect of the chemical that was building up in the ecosystem, right? So the impact of what we are doing to the planet eventually reaches a tipping point. So this is a classical example of how damages all the kind of impact that we are having. What looks minor can over years build up to such an extent that it reaches a tipping point beyond which you need to pump in so much money. Today, I think these just 4 centers require nearly 15 crores, and money is not coming by easily. COVID is one of the reasons why there has been budget cuts all over. And obviously BNHS is also struggling to maintain these birds because there is huge amount of food and you can't just feed them anything. Obviously they have to get the best quality of meat. And so people who are listening to me should understand, A, what we do today can impact the unborn generations tomorrow. 2, it is always better and energy efficient to protect what there is rather than allow it to go and then bring it back. The amount of money that one spends to bring a species back from the brink is so much more than the money that one needs to spend to just maintain the forest quality or the species that are extant on this planet. And so I cannot imagine an ecosystem without vultures. I feel that they epitomize freedom. I feel lonely in those landscapes. I have a habit of lying on the floor looking at the sky. When I was growing up in the early 70s and 80s, I'd never seen a sky where I can't see a frictionless flyer like a vulture. And there was a phase of almost 10-15 years when those birds just vanished and I felt lonely in those forests as my skies were no longer as enticing as the vultures made it to be. So I think we must value all species. We just keep thinking about the tiger and the elephant and the charismatic species around. But vultures have a very, very important ecological role to play because they remove dead and decaying animals. And there are so many pathogens that can breed in these animals that can actually escape dead bodies and infect human beings and other species. Another thing that comes to mind is that when there were high number of vultures, there was hardly any meat available because vultures can really finish off a carcass of a big cow or a buffalo. If 100 or 150 vultures just stoop down upon a dead animal, they will be able to finish, clean every single bone of that animal in less than a couple of hours. With the removal of these vultures, those dead bodies were there left decaying, and that actually attracted a lot of dogs. So these dogs, which were actually domestic dogs, I'm not talking about wild dogs here, dogs that belong to people who lived in the village, they suddenly started treating those dead animals as restaurants, and their population exploded. And as I talk, I think somewhere close to 50,000 people die of rabies even today in India because of feral dogs or dog bites. And so a species, you would say there is no connection between a vulture and a dog, but the removal of vultures actually resulted in an explosion of dog population. And obviously vultures don't go and bite human beings, but dogs and human beings are again the main reasons why dog attack them, because they will throw a stone at a dog or whatever it is. And that created another issue. So it's like when we talk of the web of life and you injure one part of the web, the ripples of that are felt by so many species, some that are obvious like the vulture dog connection, but there are so many more that we don't know. And so we need to be very, very conscious and follow a precautionary principle when it comes to nature. We must revere and respect what exists today. We must rebuild the ecosystems that are degraded, and we must respect every single life on this planet, that we must celebrate all life on earth, whether it is on land or in the sea. It doesn't matter. So vulture is a symbol for me of a species that is formidable yet vulnerable, and also of human resolve that we are very destructive, but if we decide and if we use science and if we collaborate, we can really create miracles. So I hope people who are listening to me will also start funding programs like that. Contact Bombay Natural History Society and also other breeding centers, because I think the responsibility should not just rest with the government or an NGO or anybody. These are our own assets, and we must do everything possible in whatever little way we can to strengthen the field of conservation. With this, I would urge you to, whenever you are out in nature, just don't keep looking for animals on the ground. Look up and you will be happy that you were born in this fascinating planet, because those vultures will make you want to fly.